Believe it or not long ago, the notion in the term birth defects was hardly used. Congenital malformations were of no major interest to the medical profession nor science, and scientific medical teratology hardly existed. These permanent changes of society and sciences as well as medicine can be traced to one man, and what follows is his story. And this is indeed the story of one man, Josef Warkany. It is presented in three perspectives: by a colleague who considers him his mentor and friend. This present perspective is in electronic nature. Warkany was born in Vienna, where he studied medicine and trained in pediatrics, following which he emigrated to the United States. But he left with big ideals and concepts. They guided his scientific and medical career. Warkany had many influences that one could call direct and indirect mentors. Not far from where he lived Sigmund Freud, Adolf Hitler, and other prominent figures we'll mention later. And while in medical school, among many mentors, three stand out. The reason being that they inculcated in Warkany notions of a blend of medical ethics with the importance of direct, but in particular indirect prevention, of the importance of keeping an open mind and welcoming exceptions, and a senior instructor of pediatrics, Dr. Bela Schick, who always spoke of performing research in the clinical setting. In fact, permit me to say that if a clinician doesn't do research in the clinical setting, who would? The first perspective, called of dreaming on solid grounds and silent triumphs, focuses on indeed how Warkany transformed dreams into solid realities, many of which became recognized and many of which are still silent triumphs. The most recent perspective, the second one, concerns the gestation of the Teratology Society in Warkany's brain, which reflects his experience with what became the March of Dimes Birth Defects Foundation. This experience had an impact on the creation and subsequent development of the Teratology Society. The third perspective, being of electronic nature, allows us to include short snippets of video interviews of Josef Warkany, where he speaks of many of the events presented in the two previous overviews and presented as well in the present one. Furthermore, it is possible to include etchings which were the favorite mode of Warkany to express his feelings and even certain political views, which otherwise he never spoke of. And included as well as are his elegant sayings, which show a blend of science, common sense, medical wisdom, and humanism. Should we have asked Warkany, "Who are you?" he surely would have answered, "Ego sum me," or "I am me." But he would promptly add, "and my circumstances." This fulfills his awareness of the saying by the philosopher José Ortega Gasset that we are not just me, we also express the circumstances that allow us to express ourselves. So we will focus on circumstances, that is, which were them to allow Warkany to become a pioneer, a clinician, a scientist, a leader, an idealist, an artist. For these circumstances are concurrently the history of pediatrics and its scientific progress. Among all the contributions by Warkany, the most essential is the elimination of a once popular dogma. The dogma asserted that congenital anomalies were genetic in nature and for the most part inherited from flawed parents. Warkany demonstrated scientifically that, as he stated, a child suffering from congenital malformations can no longer be dogmatically held as a portent of parental faults, nor can a fetus be considered immune from environmental assaults. This fact has changed society forever. Warkany was born in Vienna in 1902. It was the capital of a multinational vast Habsburg Empire. It was a major center of cultural ferment, from music, architecture, science, and medicine, to political movements such as National Socialism, Communism, Zionism, among others. The fermentation led to an explosion known as World War I, following which emerged the much smaller Austrian Republic. This change allowed Warkany to study medicine. Before he could not, because he was not a citizen. His family was from Hungary. Warkany described his Viennese neighborhood as a voluntary rich ghetto and pointed out that not far from his dwelling lived Sigmund Freud, Hitler, and Theodor Herzl. Here are some illustrations of this ferment. In Prague, a manifestation in 1905 demanding universal vote for the Czech people, a vast conglomerate of different nationalities were providing a background fire of nationalism, challenging the authority of the Austro-Hungarian dominance, a rule of very creative music and artistic expressions, and all of this ferment culminating in World War I and the crash of the empire and its reduction to a small Republic of Austria. At the time, Warkany was interested in architecture. This aesthetic penchant remained with him for life, and this artistic inclination always concerned subjects that indicated sensitivity to social issues. So let Warkany speak about these matters. But note that he is very diplomatic, very rarely makes political statements, although his political perspectives are obvious in his etchings.
You told me that you started off in architectural school in Vienna, and how come you changed from architecture to medicine, and we nearly missed this opportunity of sitting in this room, I would guess?
Well, there is a complicated history about this. I was born in Vienna, but my citizenship was Hungarian, and and I graduated from high school or the gymnasium. I wasn't admitted as a citizen to the medical school, but I was admitted to architecture. So I went into architecture and I studied there for 4 days. And then I found out that the colleagues there were better than I in projective geometry, in drawing, and so on. In the meantime, the political situation changed, and I became a citizen of Austria, and now was admitted to the medical school. That's how I switched from architecture to medical school.
When Warkany left Vienna for the United States, there is no question that he already acquired some big principles from his mentors. 3 of these mentors call my particular attention: von Pirquet, Wagner-Jauregg, and von Rokitansky. Please note that the von in red is also crossed because Warkany had a democratic spirit and felt that with the collapse of the Habsburg Empire, nobility titles were no longer relevant. The name von Pirquet is likely to be familiar for most listeners because of his association with the use of tuberculin as a measure of sensitivity. The original term allergy coined by von Pirquet was far broader and referred to the role of the host in most diseases, infectious or otherwise. For Warkany, this field was critical. The maternal-fetal interactions during the first trimester determined the survivability of the embryo. And this process, often the spontaneous elimination of an embryo, Warkany referred to as teratothanasia. According to his notions, one could sustain or provoke the phenomenon of teratothanasia. Warkany's synthesis of the recommendations and impact of von Pirquet on his attitudes was that he always stressed that what should be investigated is what is most important. And for Warkany, that question was why children die, in particular during the first trimester of gestation. Regarding Julius Wagner-Jauregg, it is reasonable to assume that you don't remember who he was. But he did get a Nobel Prize for indirect treatment of neurosyphilis. His approach underscored that investigations of pathogenesis are equally or perhaps even more important than research of etiology. Wagner-Jauregg inculcated in Warkany the notion that investigation of pathogenesis is of equal importance than studies of etiology. He summarized this impact by saying that pathogenesis should be studied to identify the weakest links where the chain of the translation of etiology into a phenotype can be broken. And he also noted that in teratology, investigations of etiologic factors often become long affairs and often have little to offer in terms of prevention. It was almost like a prediction that today is illustrated by the fact that enrichment of flour with folic acid decreases the prevalence of neural tube defects, although it is no proof that such malformations are due to folate deficiencies. Regarding Rokitansky, probably his last name is known to most clinicians because it is associated with several syndromes of malformations. However, he is remembered more as a humanist and philosopher. He is remembered for his lectures, during one of which he stated, "Scientists should first regard humans as conscious and free-willing subjects. The feeling of humanity would be lost if physicians regarded human beings purely as research objects." Rokitansky introduced the importance of medical ethics virtually in all aspects of the medical education granted by the Medical School of the Vienna University, and is regarded by many as one of the fundamental pioneers of this discipline. And perhaps we should listen to Warkany speak of those times.
And who got you into pediatrics, Joe?
I chose it because I wanted to specialize and not to be specialized. And pediatrics is a science where you treat the whole patient, or a branch of medicine. I realize that now my wife has a broken hip, and to find a doctor who looks not only at the heart or at the hip, but also at the foot where she has a blister, that's hard to find. And
that is one doctor, in other words.
the pediatrician looks at the heart and the heel.
Not anymore.
And the heel.
Yeah, no. Sure it is.
No, really, it was the idea to have a little child that you could look over from head to foot. And I haven't regretted that.
Your pediatric training was in Vienna then?
In Vienna. And the first one, I was, I think, a year and a half at the clinic of the famous PK, or Van PK, as you say here.
The test.
Oh, yes.
Wasn't that the tuberculin test?
Well, he's
See
the
what,
man.
what I remember from my pediatrics?
Of course.
Of course, all right.
But do you know that he is the man who made the word allergy and the concept of allergy? He was one of the greatest. And, but he was, how should I say, an unusual man, but a very great one. He had the big concepts, which I liked and which impressed me most. Like concept of allergy. To him, the contagious diseases were allergic diseases. The virus got into you and the body reacted to it, and he described that and so on. By the way, his first assistant was Bela Schick, whose name you know too.
He came here to
He
this country
came here
last
and
year.
was in New York.
I met him once.
Yes. He left the clinic before I got into the clinic, but we met later, and he was very fine.
Warkany was ready to join the Cincinnati team, and his dream then already was to spend his life in research, not only of causes, but their pathogenesis, with an intent to emphasize prevention and clinical care. Here is a drawing of how Cincinnati looked in the 1930s. And also is illustrated a mantra. Unless we are interested in the prevention as well as the cure, we have all of us failed. Neither the drawing nor the mantra are attributed to Warkany, but they are attributed to a native pediatric hero. The native pediatric hero was Dr. Albert Graham Mitchell, and so was the author of the mantra. His ideals and those of Warkany matched perfectly. Mitchell was the chairman of pediatrics at the Children's Hospital, and his dreams were energized by a lifelong partnership with Mr. William Cooper Proctor, who not only was a successful businessman, but a committed philanthropist. Mr. Proctor donated, in today's terms, nearly $50 million to expand the Children's Hospital Clinic to emphasize research in pediatrics. And on the lower right is depicted the result. One of the most prestigious and substantive teams of pediatric research, not only in the United States, but possibly in the world. Prevention was synthesized as an ideal in many elegant ways by Warkany. Here is one. From a medical point of view, no disease can be considered fully investigated and understood until it can be prevented and eliminated. And there are examples where it's understood, but it's neither prevented nor eliminated. And Warkany has some interesting words about those times.
What brought you to America, speaking of New York?
Well, that's a long story, but I wanted to continue clinical work with research work. I never was too much impressed with private practice in those days. We had only very few real treatments. And private practice was a very unsatisfactory field as far as I was concerned. And I did already a little research in Vienna, and I wanted to combine these two things. And I had some very fine friends in Vienna and in Germany. And one of the men, Professor Freudenberg from Marburg, said he couldn't take me, but he had been in America, and he could recommend me to somebody. That somebody was Dr. Mitchell, and one day I got a letter from Dr. Mitchell. I can offer you a scholarship, $1,500, to pay your trip back and forth, and live here for a year. Was wonderful.
$1,500?
Yeah.
That was a lot of money.
It was a lot
no,
of money.
It
Yeah.
was
I
terrible.
lived like a king on Erkenbrecker. I lived in every house on Erkenbrecker. You have seen those bronze tablets?
That's where Joe Warkany
Warkany lived for 6 months. Then he
was
was
far away from the hospital, right around the corner.
Yeah, I had no car, of course. No, seriously, this was one of those lucky things that happened to me. I got here when the Research Foundation was new. They had been going only 1 year. I loved it, and they didn't object to me too much, so I could come back after 1 year. That wasn't so easy to immigrate in those days, but they made it possible for me, and I had the most wonderful recommendations that Dr. Mitchell and Mr. Proctor got for me. Charlie Taft was one of them.
He's still alive.
Yeah.
That's on
I
the
wrote him.
symphony the other day.
Yeah, I wrote him to remind him whom he brought into this country.
And let's ask about the Nelson boys. There were two of them.
Yes.
Waldo.
Well,
and-
Waldo Nelson, the office boy, developed very well. He became professor of pediatrics in Philadelphia at
Temple.
Temple.
Temple,
Temple, yeah.
and got into a department that had only one other, two other full-time members, and he made one of the outstanding departments there. He took over the book of Mitchell, and it became Mitchell-Nelson, and then Nelson's textbook of pediatrics, which was one of the best and still goes under different names today. And he took over the Journal of Pediatrics and made of a third-class journal a first-class journal. So that was a good office boy.
His brother is a professor somewhere.
His brother worked with George Guest in carbohydrates. They made I think a sugar test together, and then he became in New York the head of a cancer institute there. I don't know exactly which, and he is now one of the leaders in oncology.
Waldo Nelson was one of the earliest members of the research team that soon after was joined by Warkany. He took over the Mitchell-Nelson's textbook, which became world famous. And this book was the loudest loudspeaker that Warkany could possibly have to introduce and disseminate his novel views of pediatrics and the role of teratology in it. Already from the earliest contributions to this very influential textbook, and much before the advent of Medical Genetics and Teratology Society, Dr. Warkany stressed the importance of prenatal factors in diseases of children, where he stated that eugenic measures and advice are not restricted to the genetic aspects of prenatal life. The fetus should be assured protections of the mother from adverse environmental influences. And before and at and after the 5th edition of 1950, in this textbook, Warkany wrote about prenatal factors of disease, genetic factors and non-genetic factors, intrauterine and environmental factors, and what today is known as genetic counseling, a term that he considered inappropriate, as well as syndromes of skeletal defects and other malformations. Shown here is a sample page from the textbook of pediatrics by Nelson. This chapter, with the title of Advisability of Parenthood, today probably would have a title of Genetic Counseling. Warkany writes that not all congenital anomalies and defects are hereditary, and not all hereditary anomalies are congenital. Here is an example of his consideration that false language is misleading and nurtures wrong dogmas. And then Warkany continues, saying, explain to the prospective parents the chances of having a normal and abnormal children, and then let the parents make their decision. The embryo and fetus should be assured, so far as possible, by protection of the expectant mother of adverse environmental influences. This is almost like a prophecy, for example, to avoid alcohol during or before pregnancy. And very often he posed the question, why then the prejudice of calling an advisory clinic a heredity or genetic counseling clinic? It is a clinic for parental counseling, after all. And that dilemma continues. It is hard for us to imagine how little it was known at the time about teratogens and teratology, and how limited was the medical knowledge about congenital malformations outside of the single gene patterns of inheritance. Here's a page from a popular then clinical genetics book, edited by Arnold Sorsby and written by many authors, contrary to the book by Warkany, which has the homogeneity and harmony of a single author. Here's a page written by the respectable human geneticist Dr. Beck from the Uppsala University, and there is a hint that regarding participating genetic factors in conditions of unknown origin were open to debate. Some doubts were arising. And note how little it was possible to write about Mongolism, or what became known as trisomy 21, or about cretinism, where no mention of iodine is made. And in the index of these multi-hundreds of pages book, there is no reference to teratogens nor teratology. As he made contributions to the textbook of pediatrics, he also collected information for his magnum opus, the book referred to as Congenital Malformations, and which he subtitled very humbly as Notes and Comments. This is a classic in my view because it's not only a source of information, but it is also a source of wisdom. And this is what he wrote about the creation of this magnum opus. I will let the screen on for a little while so you can read it calmly. And next, let Warkany speak about this topic.
That the field of congenital malformations was still very small, and I thought I could do it in 2 years. Well, things happened. I got sick, and congenital malformations increased in number, not in subject of research, and it took me 25 years to deliver the manuscript to the book publishers in Chicago, and that's why it came out in 1970. It should have been out before. And it's one volume, which makes it too heavy, and some people who had it in bed got gangrene of the feet and accused me of causing that. Well, by now, instead of this one volume, there must be 50 or 60 volumes of congenital malformations. But you are right. I contributed many pictures of patients and many pictures of our experimental animals and brought these two things together. There are not many books that have both children and animal teratology.
Warkany's interest in children was not limited to congenital malformations. One example is Acrodynia, now a dead disease. It also brings the notion often mentioned by Warkany that victories of this kind often remain silent triumphs. Acrodynia was due to mercury poisoning. It impacted children because it was fashionable to utilize teething powders which contained this poison. Many would believe that it was sufficient to prove the cause for the marketing of such poison to be discontinued. But Warkany knew better. He was aware that it took over 130 years after the discovery that iodine prevents cretinism for the adoption of laws mandating the fortification of salt with iodine, in particular in those regions, mountainous like the Alps, that were associated with higher frequencies of cretinism. And so he published his findings in 1948, but did not cease its advocacy to the full prevention. That is, yes, we understood the cause, but we did not eliminate the disease. And he knew that removal of the cause may be a source of stress and even of ridicule, which he suffered abundantly. And furthermore, he realized that these events provided a lesson for those interested in medical ethics, and wrote a report on the post-mortem of this disease. And in the interest of brevity, you can read this screen by stopping the motion, and I will move on to further grounds. So in summary, Acrodynia became a dead disease. And this etching conveys some of the feelings of Warkany for this victory. Why would he call the victory a silent triumph? Because it was so. People forgot about it. Very few pediatricians may even know what acrodynia is all about. Mercury poisoning persists, but in other forms. And he remarks in one of his writings that even 16 years after the discovery of the cause, that is mercury, one single manufacturer was selling 30 million doses of teething powder this many years after being aware that his product may be poisonous. I believe it is of interest to hear Warkany speak about acrodynia as a dead disease. Let's listen.
Warkany, how did you get involved in teething powder? For instance, and what was the sequence that... Teething powder.
You mean acrodynia?
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's another thing that has nothing to do with congenital malformations and mental retardation. I was making rounds over at the general hospital, and I saw occasionally, very rarely, a child with acrodynia. Those of you who are so ignorant don't know what acrodynia is, it's pain at the points of the fingers and pinkness, high blood pressure, sleeplessness, and so on and so on. It's a terrible disease. It was very rare here, but there was no explanation. And then I found out that in some countries it was customary to rub the gums of teething children with calomel, which is a mercurial compound, usually very harmless, but occasionally inducing, come in, I pay $1. Not enough. So they rubbed teething powders in, which were sold by the millions all over. It was that where the British flag waved. That's where Stedman sold the teething powders. Well, when we found out here in the Kettering laboratory that children, the few children we had a high mercury amount in their urine, we expressed our opinion after 40 cases in the Lancet, and then they told us about teething powders, which we didn't know anything about. And so it was found out that the most frequent cause of acrodynia were teething powders. And in England and in everywhere where the British flag waved and Stedman sold its powders. Does that answer your question, or did I talk about something else? Yeah? No, I asked you. Okay.
Tell me about your own disease. Tell me about Warkany's disease.
What's that?
Tell me about acrodynia.
Oh, that's not Warkany's disease. Warkany finished. Well, he was instrumental finishing it. Well, there was a disease, acrodynia. You know it, and you know it. It doesn't exist anymore. And I didn't know it. And because we had very few cases wherever I was, but it was endemic in other places like Australia and England and in the south of this country and so on. And we had a few cases over at General, you remember, on the H ward?
Yeah, sure.
And it fascinated me because it was a non-febrile disease which was terrible. It the teeth fell out, the children couldn't sleep, the parents couldn't sleep, and so on. Not a febrile disease. Well, when I came here, one day Dr. Mitchell said, you better take the board, Ohio State Board. So I had to take the Ohio State Board and learn all I had forgotten. It was 7 years of getting my degree. And among other things, I had to learn toxicology, and I read about arsenic poisoning, and here was a description of acrodynia. So I went to Dr. Mitchell, said, I know what causes acrodynia, arsenic. He said, oh, that has been said before, it isn't true. It isn't so. So it wasn't arsenic, but it behaved like arsenic poisoning. And then I saw 2 children at Contagious Hospital were sent in with scarlet fever, but they had thallium poisoning. And again, they had some sort of acrodynia. So the Kehoe laboratory was always most helpful. And I discussed it with them if I could send over a blood sample and an urine sample of these children. We had just a few of them. And if they would search for inorganic poisoning, I have still the request sheet. Inorganic, they should look for inorganic toxic factors. They looked in the blood, didn't find anything. And then there was a Mr. Hubbard there who had made a mercury determination in the urine. Mr. Sholak said, why don't you try your mercury method?
Jake
and there
Sholak.
it was.
Yeah. And that was mercury.
There was a lot of mercury in the urine of 1, 2, or 3 children, and then we had to send out for other urines from
How
all
did they
over
get the mercury?
country. Through teething powders or worm treatment. They were.
What another disease has been eliminated?
It was established that children with acrodynia had large amounts of mercury in the urine, and eventually it was found that mercury was the cause of acrodynia, and this was one of those fortunate coincidences into which I fell, and that can happen to anybody who is in a big medical school like ours and keeps his eyes open.
It's an exciting story to hear that, and it's sort of a serendipity type thing. You
It
were
definitely
thinking arsenic
was,
and came out
looking
with
for
mercury.
arsenic and finding mercury. The main thing, the lesson is, don't have your mind made up. If your theory doesn't help, if it can't be substantiated, you should change your theories. And that's the only merit I had in this. Finally, when in England the hypothesis of mercury poisoning was established, they all came around. And then they tried to treat it with substances that led to increased excretion of mercury, etc., etc. But the answer is not the treatment, the answer is prevention.
Warkany was fully aware of the deep roots of the dogma that held the view that congenital malformations were inherently genetic in nature. He did not hesitate to challenge the dogma. In the United States, the notion of eugenics was likewise strongly rooted in its society. The roots originated from the views of Leonard Darwin, the son of Darwin, and were upheld by many of the most prominent experts in human genetics of its time. Shown here is Dr. Fisher, considered the father of medical statistics. Their attention was focused on the feeble-minded, on what it was portrayed as habitual criminals. It focused on the necessity of birth control, on selection of marriage. All of that translated into racism. The societies were even named for the betterment of race. Illustrated here is how these roots of the dogma invaded notions of capitalism, promoted social Darwinism, was equated with eugenics, and even marketing nutrients, and some manipulations of issuing eugenic certificates to unsuspected couples, all of which is subsumed nowadays in forms of genetic counseling, misguided and premature notions that caused harm. And when one of the neighbors of Josef Warkany in Vienna was elected Chancellor of Germany, that is Adolf Hitler, that German state improved and legalized the process, leading to eugenics, racism, euthanasia, and eventually to the Holocaust. The weapon to destroy the dogma was experimental teratology. The dogma was mortally wounded and soon perished. The first fatal blow to the dogma were the results of the experimental teratology investigations by Warkany. He demonstrated that manipulation of the maternal diet could produce structural malformation in the offspring. And soon thereafter, he commented that the science of nutrition should be concerned, therefore, not only with the maintenance of the human machine, but should also pay attention to its sound construction. It is almost like a prophecy of what today we know of folates and fortification of flour with folic acid as a means to reduce the prevalence of neural tube defects. The second fatal blow followed the thalidomide epidemics that demonstrated conclusively that a new medication consumed by pregnant women could induce severe malformation patterns in their offspring. On the right end of this gallery is shown a statue of a prominent United Kingdom artist, well known for her wit and intelligence. She also illustrates the principle of teratology that teratogens have specific impacts on the embryonic system. And next, we can hear Warkany refer to experimental teratology, the source of the first fatal blow to the mentioned dogma.
Our first, and this is interesting, our first attempt was to produce an endocrine condition called endemic cretinism, which I had seen in Austria. It's a thyroid deficiency due to iodine deficiency, and these people have congenital deafness. So we started together with Rose Nelson, Rose Cohen Nelson, whom you remember, started experimental work. We failed completely. We could not produce endemic cretinism, but we found something much better. We found with these diets skeletal anomalies, which were the beginning of experimental teratology in 1938-40.
But I'd like to get back to Josef Warkany.
That's not worthwhile. Much more.
Tell me,
so one day,
what brought you
Dr. Mitchell took me, I was a bachelor then, so he took me along on trips to Huntington, West Virginia. He had a consultation there, and I had to keep him from going to sleep. So he took me along, and he said, well, we started talking, rickets is dying, scurvy is dying. I wonder what I should do. I said, what would you think if I would take up endocrinology? He said, good idea. So I took up endocrinology and ran the endocrine clinic over there for many years. I knew nothing, of course, but I ran the clinic. And most of the patients I had were not endocrine patients. They were patients with congenital anomalies. And I thought that's a more important field, still think so, than endocrinology. And I took that up and did it first experimentally. And clinically, I was in it already, and I got into this field.
The fact that congenital malformation could be due to an environmental influence upon a mother needed emphasis in those years. Hitler, you see it was 1930, Hitler had declared in Germany that all congenital malformations were hereditary and that the reproduction of parents of malformed children had to be limited. There was a law that was published in Germany and then with Hitler's conquests all over Europe. But also in this country, particularly in California, there was a strong movement to keep the reproduction of families in which mental retardation occurs limited. I'll talk to this a little later again.
I saw people with endemic cretinism in Austria when I was a young fellow. I was told the cause of this strange condition of dwarfism and mental retardation and deafness is lack of iodine in the diet. Well, we tried to produce endemic cretinism in rats, and we failed, but we got something better, namely the riboflavin deficiency that was in the diet missing too. And so again, here was serendipity. I was going to do one thing and I found something better maybe. Well, in 1954, I got the chance to travel through Europe to see what had become of endemic cretinism. And there I found that endemic cretinism did not occur anymore in children in Switzerland, and there are only very few left in Austria. I didn't find any children in France, but I found many cretins in their 50s who were left over. That gave me a very nice opportunity to travel through the Alps and to meet some of the people who had been active in the prevention of endemic cretinism by introducing iodized salt. And since iodized salt is now available in Switzerland and everywhere else, endemic cretinism has disappeared in children. Still some left in adults, but these are the remnants. Well, this was teaching me a story of prevention, and that prevention could be done beautifully by man's activity, but it had taken 100 years between the discovery of iodine and the disappearance of cretinism. Nowadays things go faster, like in Acrodynia, for instance. Well, the story of endemic cretinism is a fascinating one. It doesn't interest anybody anymore because the condition doesn't exist in this country. However, still endemic cretins in Asia and in New Guinea, where Dr. Gajdušek has described cases, and so it's one of my favorite stories.
That's beautiful.
So I soon recognized that there was a huge area of children's diseases that then had not found pediatric attention. Thus, I turned to congenital malformations as the area to which I might make some contributions. I hope to supplement my clinical work with experiments in animals. And there I remembered endemic cretinism, an old love of mine, which I had learned about as a student on my trips through the Alps, where I saw deaf and dumb dwarfs shivering in the sun and incapable of work. They had a syndrome of congenital anomalies which, I was told, was not hereditary but due to goiter and iodine deficiency of their mothers. Thus, my collaborator, Dr. Rose Cohen Nelson, and I tried to breed goitrous rats, hoping that their offspring would show signs of cretinism. To make it short, in this endeavor we failed, but we obtained young that had skeletal malformations of the ribs, the mandible, the tibia, and radius, a syndrome which was much more interesting to the medical profession than endemic cretinism, which nobody had seen in this country. And this syndrome had been produced by a deficient maternal diet and could be prevented when the mother's diet was supplemented by liver. Further, experiments showed that it was riboflavin in liver that was the preventive factor, a surprising result, since riboflavin had not been considered an essential constituent of bone. Actually, riboflavin was needed for development of the skeleton before ossification and chondrification in the mesenchymal stage. It had taken 4 years to develop these concepts, and it took another 3 years to confirm our experiments in France. So why they let me do that, I don't know. But there was room here on the second floor, and I was allowed to dawdle around and did. The fact that congenital malformation could be due to an environmental influence upon a mother needed emphasis in those years.
Which we know to be the study of birth defects, most of which lead into mental retardation. Can you just tell us how you got into that from your days of phosphorus and calcium and so forth?
In the clinic for a few years, but interestingly, most of the patients referred to me were patients with congenital malformations. Okay. That's how I got into congenital malformations clinically, and then I also tried to get into production of animals with congenital malformations, and we succeeded in producing skeletal malformations in rats by dietary regime. And that's how I slowly left endocrinology and got into congenital malformations. I would reject the term father of teratology because that would make me very old. Teratology is thousands of years old and has been cultivated by ancient peoples, etc., for various reasons. My interest was prevention of congenital malformations and mental retardation, which also is usually or very often caused by congenital malformations.
The experience of Warkany with the March of Dimes was transformative. He was introduced as a consultant to the foundation by Albert Sabin, and following his experience with this organization, Warkany proceeded to take every step quite energetically to create the Teratology Society. Let him say a few words.
I, in the 1950s, went to the what's now called March of Dimes and was then called National Foundation, and so he gave me a good, he was acquainted with them because of his work with poliomyelitis. He gave me a good recommendation, and we were always on good terms and still are.
Sure. And that was March of Dimes' singular effort in those days was strictly on polio. And
that's correct. And they looked, after polio was practically solved by the two vaccines, they looked for other fields of endeavor, and I worked out for them congenital malformations, and of all things, Still's disease, childhood rheumatism. And that was a very interesting period. I could travel all over and interview people, and then I developed programs which were submitted to the big people of the National Foundation. And they picked both of them, namely congenital malformations and childhood rheumatism. But pretty soon they limited it to congenital malformations. Now, where did the word birth defects come in? That wasn't used until the National Foundation made it one of their programs, and they thought that the common people wouldn't know what congenital malformations are, but they would understand birth defects. So they introduced that term.
The participation of Warkany in the plans of what today is known mostly as March of Dimes was quite successful. He was instrumental in helping the foundation to shift its attention from poliomyelitis and recommended that the new emphasis should be on congenital malformations. The president of the foundation, Mr. Basil O'Connor, felt that the term congenital malformations would not elicit sufficient popular support, and changed this to the rubric birth defects, today quite well known generally. However, Mr. Basil O'Connor had to inform Dr. Warkany that the scientific committee recommended that the foundation perform research mainly on genetic causes rather than teratogens regarding the frequency and nature of congenital malformations. This led Warkany to fear that the attention toward teratogens would be insufficient. He remarked, "How is one to convince scientific advisors that are mostly experts in viral genetics, that is poliomyelitis, of the importance of structural malformations?" And then later he commented, "Those who pay attention to genetic factors only do a poor service to the science of genetics." And following these events, Warkany shifted his attention to organizing a society of teratology. In approximately 2 years, the ground was prepared, and Warkany was elected by acclamation president of the association, to be followed by a second president, his associate James Wilson. It is fair to say that the first 3 presidents of the Teratology Society provided a solid ground for its development. That is demonstrated by what happened since. And we can hear Warkany address those times.
For many years, and he was the second president of the Teratology Society.
When I was a student in medical school here, Dr. Wilson was one of the instructors in anatomy, and I remember him well. Do you recall about when he came? And he really did serve many years here until his death just within this past year.
Yes. Well, he was here twice. Joined the anatomy department, and then he was made professor of anatomy in Gainesville, but then he came back here when we opened up our IDR, Institute of Developmental Research, and he had a division there, and we cooperated for many, many years in a very happy way.
The Society just celebrated its 25th anniversary, the Teratology Society, and met in Georgia for that 25th year and established the Josef Warkany lectureship annually for the Society. And it's a thrill to me to know that they purchased 20 of your etchings, and we'll talk about that later, to present to the visiting lecturer or the guest lecturer each of those years.
Yes, they get an etching. That's a punishment thing. So, well, that's a great honor, and sometimes the lectures are on a level which I can't understand anymore, but that's all right. It shows progress in teratology.
Sure.
Previously, we alluded to the lessons that can be learned from the post-mortem of the disappearance of the disease Acrodynia. But Warkany also wrote a second lesson, this one much more important in a way because it illustrates the strength and decency of his character. The title is Why I Doubted That Thalidomide Was the Cause of the Epidemic of Limb Defects of 1959. And he states that my skepticism in 1962 needs an explanation. Indeed, at the time, the new science of teratology was facing extraordinary pressure to rule on issues of teratogenesis, while the science and the data available at the time were quite new and needed extreme caution before an agent could be labeled as teratogenic. Here is an example of the enormous pressure put on Warkany, in particular because he was the first president of the Teratology Society. Right at the start of the society, the U.S. Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association appointed a commission on drug safety with the charge to seek new knowledge of the predictability of action of drugs in man. And Dr. Warkany was engaged as the chairman of a subcommittee on teratology. Eventually, with the assistance of the second president of the Teratology Society, they published proceedings of a report under the title Teratology, Principles and Techniques. Some years later, in 1977, Dr. Wilson, this time with Dr. Fraser, published a handbook on teratology, where included were general principles, and where Wilson added a sixth principle to those he outlined in 1959. These are examples, but it is best if we hear Warkany speak of those times.
Thus we traveled with our exhibit, and somewhere down in the stairs is still a box with cleared specimens with which we traveled around, showing our deformed rats to medical and other scientific meetings to emphasize the possibility of environmental causes of congenital malformations, a thesis which prepares the scientific world for the thalidomide accident which occurred 15 years later. The malformations which occurred in epidemic form in Germany, I'm talking about thalidomide, in Germany, England, and many other countries where it first thought to be hereditary, but by then the experiments of Hale and ours had prepared the medical world to the possibility of external causation and the possibility that the drug taken by mothers was soon accepted. This practical application of teratology had, of course, a great influence on the small group of scientists who, up to 1960, had done experimental work with congenital malformations. There was suddenly a demand by legislators and politicians to answer practical questions which we could not yet answer. And our quiet life in the laboratory was suddenly disturbed. We had to serve on committees and commissions to give advice about testing methods that were sure to eliminate teratogenic drugs. Generally, we admitted that we did not know of such methods. In litigations about birth defects, it is now often assumed only environmental causes are responsible for the children's malformations, particularly drugs. Lawyers, judges, and laypersons often assume that any drug taken by a pregnant woman is responsible for the child's defect. It's not easy to explain how many other possibilities exist to deform an unborn child. There are some good teratologists who are willing to go to court and fight for correct explanations, but there are also some neo-teratologists who pose as experts to obtain the financial spoils which a sympathetic jury sometimes gives the family of an abnormal child. I have never been to court as an expert. This has denied me income that others got, but has protected my sleep and conscience that would have been disturbed by legal procedures. Too bad you didn't know me when I was still bright. But at my age, you can't help it. You go downhill and you have to write down what you are talking about, and sometimes you can't even read it. So I have notes here, and it says, it may seem strange to talk today how I became a teratologist more than 50 years ago. The public is now kept informed by television and the daily newspapers about the most recent discoveries in embryology, obstetrics, and teratology. Some of the reports are correct, others are false. But every potential mother is eager to absorb these news and to demand answers from their medical advisors to their practical or theoretical questions.
To some degree, there is a perception that teratology is focused on structural malformations to the detriment of functional disorders such as mental retardation, which on balance are one of the most frequent congenital malformation known. Dr. Warkany is a co-author of a book on the subject and also the author of this etching, and his actions in Cincinnati demonstrate his full awareness of the leading burden and importance of mental retardation as a component of medical teratology.
The title is Mental Retardation and Congenital Malformations of the Central Nervous System.
So you've branched out to the central nervous system.
Well, it's a special part of the body, in case you don't know.
I never look at it. I don't know anything that doesn't show on an X-ray. And the brain doesn't show much.
And again, there is a tendency in that book. I think the congenital anomalies of the brain are the leading cause of mental retardation, and not perinatal
infection,
perinatal damages and postnatal damages. I know they exist, but the prenatal damages, the malformations, are, I estimate, 70%, causing 70% of mental retardation.
Well, Joe,
Jim?
go ahead.
In regard to that, tell us about how you started the Institute for Developmental Research at Children.
Did I?
Yeah, sure you did.
Oh, you shouldn't say that, because
You're the father of that.
Dr. Pratt always thought I got him in all these troubles. Well, I was then involved with the mental retardation movement, with the parents' organization. I had no trouble with the National Institute of Child Health and so on. And we heard about these centers of mental retardation research, and that one, John Kennedy was supporting this, and Congress was supporting that, and the Children's Hospital Research Foundation needed an animal house, 2-story animal house, and so I found out if we get an 8-story institute for mental retardation research, it will be cheaper than the 2-story animal house.
In the previous video snippets, Dr. Warkany referred repeatedly of his observation of cretinism, an association with iodine deficiency in the maternal diet. In this etching, I'm sure there's additional motives for its inclusion in many of his presentations, including in his famous book. This scene is from the Appalachian region, and it underscores that although the etiology of the disorder of the mother and her mentally subnormal child is well known, as is the prevention strategy, it illustrates that knowing, acting, and preventing are not necessarily concurrent. It illustrates the challenge for physicians not only to discover etiology, to understand pathogenesis, and to know how to interrupt the pathogenesis by indirect interventions. Physicians are equally responsible for the implementation of policies that prevent such necessities. The profound conviction of Dr. Warkany that mental retardation is one of the major domains of concern of teratology is reflected in the fact that he attracted Dr. Jack Rubinstein to focus his creative talents, intelligence, and dedication to the subject. Dr. Rubinstein became famous as one of the leading pioneers and director of a leading mental retardation research center, along with treatment in the sphere of United States and worldwide. His long-term follow-up of particular patients, for example, Rubinstein-Tabby syndrome, is legendary. Here on the lower right is shown the newly additions by the Cincinnati Research Foundation that in large measure provide also resources for the investigation, care, and prevention of mental developmental issues.
Thank you very much. Where did you find all of these people? She says she pays everyone $1. So don't go away without being paid. Well, when I was told to talk, I don't know to whom and when, I was told I should say, how did I become a teratologist? And then it was changed, and when I had it notes made, it took only 15 minutes, and I thought that's too short. So I extended it to mental retardation. So I'll talk about congenital malformations and pediatrics and mental retardation.
Getting back to Bill's question, Dr. Warkany, I think the origins of the idea are interesting because I believe that it started off as a discussion that you had with Dr. Rubinstein about the need for an applied research lab. And you were going up to Washington with this in mind, that this institution should perhaps establish an applied research lab, and you came back with different sorts of plans.
Well, I was active in those years in the National Institute of Health, where I was on several study sections, and I learned the workings of the National Institute of Health, of the funds available, and I learned that at one time there were funds available for Institute of Mental Retardation Research. And I was working with Mr. Grad, a lawyer here in town, who was interested in mental retardation, and we thought, why shouldn't we have an institute like that in Cincinnati. And, well, it took a few years, and we applied for it, and finally ended up with a 8-story building that was partly funded by the National Institutes of Health and partly by Cincinnati Department of Pediatrics, and was not limited to mental retardation research. That's why it was called Institute for Developmental Research, and that is a high-rise building over behind the Children's Hospital.
Warkany, one of the people that you're referring to now who was not directly related to mental retardation is Dr. Leland Clark, and I think is an interesting story how he came to be included in the Institute.
Well, Dr. Leland Clark worked with Dr. Kaplan on the machine that is used for operations in, what's the name of the machine?
Well, it's the oxygenator.
The oxygenator, heart lung machine, and I got acquainted with him. But he was at that time at Yellow Springs, and so one day I met him in a bar in New York, and I asked him if he wouldn't like to come.
There is no question, at least in my mind, that Warkany became a giant in pediatrics. And he was not just a giant concerning malformations. He eliminated Acrodynia from the face of the earth. He provided leadership toward the understanding of mental subnormality and other developmental disorders. The atomic bombs exploded in Japan had a profound impact on Warkany at multiple levels. Obviously, it was already known that ionizing radiation was a major teratogen. And in 1961, he wrote concerning microcephaly, spina bifida, excess of females, and that there was no consensus about the impacts of exposures to much smaller doses or to chronic exposures to low radiation. These perceptions impacted me considerably. And it was only decades later, after the implosion of the Soviet Union and following the independence of Ukraine, that it was possible to investigate these suggestions using international methodology. And indeed, these hypotheses were proven correct. We observed elevated population rates of microcephaly and spina bifida, along with elevated incorporated levels of cesium-137 by pregnant women, all concurrently in one area heavily polluted by the Chernobyl radiation in comparison to other regions that were studied likewise. Our first substantive report, published in the American Academy of Pediatrics Journal in the year 2010, provoked a report by The Lancet that our observations reignited a debate over the health effects of Chernobyl. We reported confirmation of these original observations 5 times, including in the Journal of Teratology of Japan and the Journal of Teratology of Europe. Nonetheless, a contradictory position continues to be held by the International Atomic Energy Agency, endorsed by the World Health Organization. They base on their view on the results of Hiroshima and Nagasaki studies, In the erroneous perception, or at least in the erroneous projection, of comparisons with the delivered radiation levels by the Hiroshima-Nagasaki explosions. Their statements indicate their conviction that there is no evidence nor is there any likelihood of observing any adverse effects on pregnancy outcome associated with Chernobyl. What is not mentioned is that those exposed to the Chernobyl disaster incorporate cesium-137 through ingestion. The effects are not due to external radiation. For how long will this debate continue? We do not know, but our hope is that there will be some attention given by international experts, and some of whom would be willing to actually test which of the two positions is supported by observations rather than hypotheses. Eventually, Warkany was recognized as a giant in pediatrics. He received multiple awards, some of which are the highest possible to be granted to such a professional. Among the most prestigious awards that can be awarded to a pediatrician is the John Howard Award. It is bestowed by the American Pediatrics Society. Here Warkany stands at the extreme right of this image, next to Sabin, one of his collaborators, and to the extreme left is Waldo Nelson, the editor of the world-famous textbook of pediatrics. The three of them, plus several other investigators of the Children's Research Foundation of Cincinnati, have changed the face of pediatrics forever. When Warkany decided to leave the March of Dimes, or in fact he was fired, he organized the Teratology Society as reported earlier. And at that time he received congratulations from Basil O'Connor for being elected its first president. It is relevant to point out that the March of Dimes was initiated by President Franklin D. Roosevelt with assistance of Basil O'Connor, but it took 25 years before the March of Dimes found Warkany again. He became the very first to receive the award of Basil O'Connor for excellence in pediatrics in 1986. Next, Warkany is going to speak about his views of having an open mind, the role of statistics, about honesty in research, and we are going to follow with perceptions evident in his etchings and elegant sayings about other matters.
I didn't have to take back much. Only one thing. Once I was told we should use statistics in our work. And we had a very fine statistician, Mrs. Brown, and I gave her the data, and she figured out that in our diets calcium played a role, and it was statistically significant. That's the only thing that could not be reproduced. But it was statistically significant. By the way, I think Albert Sabin never used statistics. It was either there or not.
But there has to be some meaning to all this, and I'd like you to sort of philosophize on what your thoughts are for the younger people who will
Well,
come along.
it has been said better by Batson, a geneticist. don't something like that. Put your exception under the rug, keep them inside.
Keep your exceptions inside.
Yeah. In other words,
translate that for a radiologist,
if you,
particularly.
It was Röntgen had the same. If you go out to produce endemic cretinism and you don't get it, don't force the anomalies you get into being endemic cretinism. You may have something better. Understand? That's what this means. The same with Acrodynia. I went to find arsenic and it didn't turn out, found something better. And people who know from the beginning what they will find and then they find it are not always the ones that are the best. You have to, I would say, honest, in research honest, not otherwise.
In this screen is illustrated the notion that administrators of scientific research funds need to keep in mind that their duty is to promote the open mind of investigators as well as to promote research honesty. But it seems like very often the result is the opposite, and the paradox is well illustrated here. Open mind produced a negative result, and investigators are supposed to indicate what they're going to find before they find it. So please read the following and we'll continue. In this etching, the purpose of Warkany is to underscore the need for clinicians to exercise humanism. For in his view, some of the clinicians that were taking care of him enhanced the notion that his solution seemed to be death. And he encapsulated these notions expressed in the etching in this elegant language. This is one of 4 etchings that illustrates points of view of Warkany of which he rarely spoke verbally. It concerns his view of the social realities in the country at the time. You can view them in silence. Regarding this etching, I think a comment is in order. As far as I can tell, Warkany did not like cats in particular. What he did is to hate dogs and their barking. Any barking dog that would wake up Warkany meant he couldn't go back to sleep. And at that prospect he was terrified. Perhaps this is why he named this etching Evil Thoughts because the evil thoughts were his own. It were not empathetic to the canines. And following are few words by Warkany concerning his etchings.
What?
Well, I think I may have now about 80 plates from which etchings can be done that I consider worth showing. And there is one of the Children's Hospital as it was when I came, and I put a few trees in to improve the view, and I'm very honored that this has become a object of gift to residents who live here, and now the founders will get it. I'm very honored that I could contribute this etching.
Similar to his etchings, many sayings by Warkany denote his sentiments and broad positions concerning ethics and humanity. They are worth of citation, and in the next 6 screens you can read them in silence. As an epilogue, and concerning what Warkany often conveyed, keep me alive, I can say that this electronic perspective and the 2 preceding ones attest to the fact that there is no doubt that the wisdom and observations by Warkany have changed society forever, and that is best conveyed by his magnus opus, as well as by the many pillars that Warkany contributed to sustain better child health. And these works deserve to be paid attention by the generations of teratologists that followed Warkany. This is a symbolic image to illustrate how future generations of teratologists find wisdom and facts that are current for their daily practice of teratology. At the center is Dr. Hans Zellweger, who was a visiting professor along with Dr. Warkany in my department. Dr. Zellweger is likewise a pioneer. He, along with his colleagues, brother Willie, and his mentor, Dr. Fanconi, are viewed by many as the fundamental creators of pediatric neurology. On the right is a young fellow fully trained in pediatrics undergoing a fellowship in teratology, and he practices this discipline to this very day. The book Congenital Malformations, Notes and Comments, which Dr. Warkany fondly called my 7-pounder, and I have referred to as magnum opus, contains facts that are relevant for the future, for facts from nature do not change with their interpretations. And I think, to the extent that this book remains current, it is the extent to which Warkany is kept alive. And this is the end of this electronic perspective. I thank you for your attention. And I sincerely hope you will invite others to view this perspective as well. And now it's time for me to please ask you to accept my best wishes.